volunteers. And I would just ask if everyone, if you have a mobile device, if you could turn it off at this time. And we just have a few people to thank. We just wanted you to know that Bookstock is a totally volunteer run and it's free to the public. It's supported in part by the following organizations who generously have made it possible to offer Bookstock without charge. The Jack and Dorothy Byrne Foundation, the Pauline Davenport Children's Fund of the Vermont Community Foundation, the Vermont Humanities Council, and the Woodstock Learning Lab. And we'd also like to give a special thanks to our media sponsor, the Vermont Standard, WCTV 8, Woodstock Community Television for taping all the author sessions, Vermont's oldest independent bookstore, and my favorite, the Yankee Bookshop, and Sustainable Woodstock. We operate on grants, local generosity, and donations. So if you can, we would appreciate it if you would drop something in the basket when you leave for a donation, and it would be greatly appreciated. Also, there is a sign-in sheet if you would like to be notified of any upcoming Bookstock events. You could just put your name and email address if you'd like. And now I'm really pleased to introduce Jennifer Militello. I'm sorry, I didn't want to say it wrong. Jennifer is an American poet, an author, and a professor. Born in New York City and raised in Rhode Island, she's taught at Brown University, the Rhode Island School of Design, the University of Massachusetts in Lowell, and she's currently teaching the MFA program at New England College. She's written 3 books of poetry, and her first nonfiction book, entitled Knockwood, is the winner of the Dzanc Nonfiction Prize. And please welcome Jennifer. Thank you.
Hi, thank you all for being here today. It is my absolute pleasure to read to you from a book that technically does not yet exist. So this book's birthday is August 13, so you'll be getting a little bit of a sneak preview before it technically is out in the world. So this is a book that deals with mental illness. It deals with domestic abuse. It deals with love, and it deals with time. And so it has 3 threads that run through it. The first is the situation that happened with my father's family as I was growing up. He was one of 4 children, and all 3 of his siblings were mentally ill. All 3 of them were institutionalized at some point in time, and 2 of them were institutionalized for most of their adult lives. And one of those, my aunt, was in an abusive marriage and had a really dramatic suicide attempt happen when she was young. And there's also the thread of a relationship I had in high school with a boy who was a criminal and who increased my rate of criminality type behavior drastically. So, and he eventually died of a heroin overdose when I was an adult. And the third is the thread of a love affair that happens and sort of coincides and is tied to that other relationship. And at some point the book highlights the fact that this boy, who was now a man who I had known when I was young, was dying of a heroin overdose just as I was entering into this later relationship. And so that's where the thread of time comes in. There's a sense that time is fluid, and how strange it is that things happen for us in a linear fashion, but it seems like things that happen can influence out of that linear sense. So the book is titled Knock Wood because there was a moment where I knocked on wood, and it wasn't real wood, it was actually a Murakami novel, and I had the sense at that moment that I was potentially causing damage to something that had happened in the past. So, so there is that sense of time as strange, outside of our understanding, really fluid. And I'm going to begin, I'll just read a few of these pieces to give you a sense of the book. I'm going to begin with a piece called The Witnesses. She had been beaten by my Uncle Tommy in the apartment right below her parents' house. Her father would have heard the crashes and screams and yelling and muffled shouts. The punches he knew were landing on his daughter's body must have echoed through his sleep, violence as the soundtrack to his dreams. Even when he couldn't hear the shouts or the scuffles, he must have imagined he could hear them, must have strained to listen through the floor for a body falling against a table or dresser, or a crashing lamp that held an interruption of air, like the sheets rustling as he turned. While the photographs on the wall rattled and loosened like teeth, while the molding shook, while the clock ticked like fists being stiffened into place, while the walls braced themselves and the kitchen pilot light hissed and flickered like breath let from between curled lips, he'd think he'd hear an open palm slap across a face, but it'd just be the bread settling in its basket. It was none of his business. He would lie on his back as his head hummed, and the pillow was like a sea in that it magnified the sounds, let his daughter's screams travel in their slow, deep way, resonate through the ear bones, resonate through the skull, carried in low frequency from the wild canyon of the mouth, from the throat's vibrato cave. He could not be more haunted if the sounds were ghosts. "It is none of my business," he would repeat to himself. She was married now. He would wrap the pillow around his head and try to keep the darkness from emphasizing the ticks of the kitchen radiator cooling down, or the dead silence of the pages of books that took possession of the living room. Cars passed. Their coming swish waned in their going. Rain fell and rattled at the windows. Snow came and muted the loudest of steps. Still he would lie, through the seasons, guessing at the scenes downstairs, hearing the rage and the plate smash and the steps running for refuge or shelter. His wife would lie beside him deep in slumber. She slept on her side, facing away, and he would wonder at her peace. Somehow she had been washed clean and made to dress each day and button each button and don each stocking and stir each pot and cook each meal and cluck when a glass was broken and scold when an item was left out of place. They were her words. It was she who would say, "It is none of our business." So he would sleep little, and when he slept, he would wake thinking he heard what he did not hear, what he had once been a baby crying in the next room, when he had risen to comfort her, tiny helpless wisp in his arms, and she had rested her dark-haired head on his shoulder as he crooned low and walked back and forth, smoothed her shock of hair and patted her knobbed back, and when she fell asleep again, lifted her as gently as he could down into the crib, arranging the blankets so that she was warm, lowering her there onto her belly where she slept best, and gazing for a moment at her dark mouth and the pinpoint of a nose, listening for her milkweed breath, closing the door gently so that the hinges stayed silent and the bottom of the door could ease over the carpet, and let her sleep, he would wish, let her sleep. He would remember her in her bedroom, barely a bedroom as a child, just a space behind a divider hardly big enough for a bed, as she sat cross-legged, surrounded by stuffed animals, listening to him remove his wing-tip shoes, unsnap the garters on his socks, listening to her mother remove her makeup in the mirror across from their bed. He knew that when she dreamed, the breath of her parents rose and mingled with her breath. Her sighs responded to their sighs, the same carpet lined their feet. He would imagine this in the same way he imagined the husband of his daughter succumbing to rage, and that rage eating at his liver like some mythological bird of prey. Then she jumped in front of a subway, something no one in the family would admit. I could imagine my aunt at the station, slim and stunning in her model's houndtooth coat, for she had been a model. Her heeled leather boots, the wind up from the track, the edges of the coat flattening, flailing. When she jumped, I imagined her black hair fell lit and long, flung like a scarf. How those presents must have felt the movement of the cars through the tunnel, heard the rumble, and leaned in anticipation, started to gather themselves, choreographed the preparatory steps and common bodily language that greets the incoming train. Newspapers were folded under arms, briefcases were lifted, the sitting stood, the standing took a few forward steps. How surprised they must have been as her shape flashed for a quarter second, suspended in the air, and the electric rail buzzed and sparked, and her trajectory arced the way electricity does, and she was thrown down just before the rush of windows and faces slowing, fathers on their way home, children with their mothers, mothers with their strollers, a platform full of new wives and old women and homeless teenagers and businessmen in suits. They would have removed their headphones and lowered their newspapers and clutched their babies close. First, the shock. Then they would have wondered whether appointments they must be present for would be missed. The woman who had been to the hairdresser saying, "Think of that poor girl's mother." The ones who couldn't wait to tell their co-workers, couldn't wait to tell their husbands over dinner as the man shoveled carrots into his mouth, "You'll never believe what happened today." Those who couldn't wait for the suspense, like telling a very good joke. They couldn't wait to be the center of that interest, the intense focused look, to hear the response and know that they had conjured it. The witnesses couldn't wait to look for it on the evening edition of the City News. They couldn't wait to cluck and judge and shake their heads. They couldn't wait to see the look on their wives' faces. They couldn't wait to tell anyone they saw, to start a conversation at the mini-mart, to wow the Palestinian baker, to mention it at the laundromat. They would say it again and again for days, for weeks. When Kathy woke, it would have been to an aura so white she must have thought it was heaven. Coming up from the underwater she hadn't expected to rise from, emerging to a vague light and tubes and wires, the chair beside her bed would have sat empty, instruments would have been ticking and breathing and beeping, and the bed sheets would have rustled with a tidal rush as she began to move. Her mouth dry, her limbs filled with lead. There would have been an IV taped into her arm, an embedded needle attached to a tube into which a clear liquid was dripping. Kathy would have liked the quiet of the IV, the jotting down of dosages, her meals coming, her gown half tied in the back, the clean sheets and uniforms and clean steps not followed by sound. She could sit and look out the window. She could sit in stasis for hours, for days. She could float weightless through the ether of her thoughts, and there was no pressure to be or talk or come back or exchange. She would have slept when she wanted and looked out the window to the building's other wing, accidentally glimpsing the ill and weak in their lit, visible rooms, sleeping slack-mouthed or trying to rise from their beds. She could see the sky change, and she could see the few flakes fall when it snowed. It would have freed her not wanting to live. The weight would have lifted a bit with the attempt. It was as if she had succeeded, as if she were dead. The room's whiteness would have swallowed her, its overhead lights and smell of snow, its whiteness as a veil she could wear as she felt covered by some holy hour, felt like a drug in the room's vein, like a floating curtain stirred by the breeze, the ease with which the nurses passed, their own quiet miles of routine, their own quiet Mobius strip from room to room, from bed to bed. Except she would have soon been pregnant with my cousin. Maybe she had been pregnant already without knowing when she jumped. Maybe she found out she was pregnant while in the hospital. Maybe the doctor had come in, pulling the bedside chair closer to her bed and sitting, crossing his ankle over and testing it on his knee so that she could see the tight black knit of his sock. Leaning in toward her, saying, "You are going to have a baby." What? What then? What could possibly have happened next? So the second piece I'll read, as I said, I was in this relationship in high school, and during that time I was arrested for a crime I hadn't realized I committed. So I had just turned 18, and I drove a few friends into a neighborhood and parked, and they got out of the car. And when they came back, they had several items that did not belong to them. And I then just brought them back to their houses and dropped them off. And that was my mistake, apparently. So I was the only one of the group who was 18, and the state police came to my house and picked me up and brought me in and had me confess when I didn't even know I had been arrested. So it was a pretty interesting experience that was narrowly escaped. So this is my letter to the judge. And it also deals with the fact that by the time this happened, this boyfriend and I had broken up, and he was dating someone else and I was dating someone else. So that is in the mix here. Dear Your Honor, of course I am guilty. I confess. I got drunk. I kissed Harry, who was not my boyfriend at the time. I drove him to Joe's house. Joe was my boyfriend at the time. I drove both of them to the quiet street and parked while they got out of the car. Their faces were lit for a second by the overhead light when it went on as they opened their doors. What was the crime again? I waited. I was drunk. The darkness, the fog, the lack of substance swallowed them. It swallowed their outlines first. It swallowed their voices last. It swallowed the trees where I waited. After a time, they returned. I listened to the conversation they had about the cell phone, the radar detector, wondering if they could make a call, joking about how they could speed now without being pulled over. Would they sell the things? What would they use the money for? I thought about the taste of Harry's lips and how they had felt as we sat outside in the dark at the pond's edge. It seemed like there were always reeds, always still bodies of water. I still loved Harry, though he had been dating Heather, though we had been sitting in the dark together that way for weeks, a secret, outside near a whisper of reeds, among a tolerance of owls, down by the old grist mill with its water wheel not turning, or down on the old Navy base with its toxic waters. I still loved him. I drove them to Joe's house. We dropped Joe off. I drove Harry to Heather's house. He held on to the stolen things. I did think of that couple sleeping, that couple who did not think they needed to lock their car doors at night, that couple not suspecting that these boys would be opening the passenger side door quietly and taking their things and then going shapeless again in the dark. Does this look at all like the statement the state police took? Does that document still exist? Over $500 worth. Larceny. I dropped him off at the bottom of her driveway. I thought of her sleeping soundly in her bed and wondered when she would first wake and what he would first tell her and what she would say before they both settled down again to sleep. I watched as he walked up. In my headlights, he was large. It seemed he was always a figure in my headlights. His shirt was white. His back was broad. He must not have planned to commit a crime that night, or he would have worn darker clothes. I thought of Joe in bed, trusting. I thought back to the time when I was Harry's girlfriend, how he had fed me M&Ms in his parents' living room, how he had listened to low music in the dark of his bed while his parents played live country music at the Oak Hill Tavern, and his little brother watched late-night reruns one room over. The first time we met, he'd been passed out in the cab of his stepbrother's truck. On our first date, we parked at the fairgrounds and drank beer in front of an escort. We walked in the fields holding hands. What was the crime again? When the police car started circling my block, I called Heather first. We were friends then. We had met up by chance a few months before at a backwoods party. The difference was Harry loved her. The difference was everyone said she was ugly and rich. The difference was her mother let Harry spend the night in her bed. The difference was she had a crush on Jeb Shartner, whose family owned the local farm, and when we would drive by after night after drinking, she would lean out the window and yell his name into the wind, and I was in love with her boyfriend. I called her and told her. The car was driving around, circling and slowing down at another house and slowing down at my house and circling again and then finally stopping, and an officer was getting out and my heart was thrilled with the drama. Would I tell on them? And I had to hang up, and the cop was at my door, tall with boots and imposing hat and some sort of decorative cord, and I wanted to cooperate because I was that kind of person, not one of them in that moment, an upstanding citizen. When I tried to talk to the officer in the car, he said it was better to wait until we were at the station. He meant it was better to wait until I had signed away my rights. When I got there, they told me, sign this paper on the dotted line, and then we can tell you what's going on. Later, when I was out on personal recognizance, I would think to myself while walking in the mall or the grocery store, I am out on bail. I had turned 18 2 weeks before. So yes, I am guilty. I drove 2 boys to a location where they committed a crime. I did not inform the authorities. I knew they had stolen expensive objects from a sleeping stranger, and I did not report this to the police. I suppose if transportation is help, I had to some degree even helped them. However, there was no conspiracy involved. Simply my inability to separate myself from the danger of loving someone who did not love me. He is a criminal, yes, but you should see inside his life. He is 17 years old, his mother is never home, his father is married to someone else. He will get Heather pregnant next year, and she will have an abortion. He will be arrested again and again for domestic violence, for other larcenies, until his childlike blue eyes no longer set him free, until he is old enough to do time. So yes, if it is a crime to be with 2 boys whose lives are already over, and to love the wrong person, and to be drunk at the wheel, and to not care for the moment whether you live or die, or are caught kissing your boyfriend's friend, or your friend's boyfriend, or whether you will face trouble from your parents when you get home, or what the future holds, if it is a crime to love the outline of his hair and the dashboard lights, and the feel of his hands on my neck and cheek, then arrest me. Send me to jail. I am the one you want. I have done it again. Serve me the sentence. I'll do the time. So I'll just read one last brief piece. One of the things about this book and the dealing with mental illness is that much of it is from a child's point of view. So a lot of these figures seem fairly overwhelming or threatening, and there is a real sense of threat in the way mental illness plays in these family members. So the last piece I'll read is something that I've kind of been thinking about. One thing that I realized as an adult was that when we would deal with these family members, we had what I call in this book procedures. We had ways to figure out how to take care of them while also sort of managing a kind of sense of public appearance when we brought them out into public. So my father's family is from Brooklyn, so we would often go down to Brooklyn to take 1 or 2 of his siblings out to lunch or go for a visit, and there were things that we did to sort of manage in that situation. So this is called Procedures for an Outing, and it deals with what would happen when we would take my aunt and my uncle, who were institutionalized in 2 separate facilities, out for lunch. If you are to take Kathy and Al to lunch, you must take them someplace familiar, a place they know, the Burger King within walking distance, or the run-down diner at the neighborhood's edge. You must remember Al's hat, any of his hats. They give him the ability to hide in public. The brim allows him to duck down and away when the room full of strangers seems too much. If Kathy gets upset, she will raise her voice. If Kathy gets euphoric, she will raise her voice. In both of these situations, if you cannot calm her down, expect that you will have to leave to keep from causing a scene. Al must be able to smoke. He can go outside to do so, but be sure he brings his cigarettes. You know from his brown fingers that he is perpetually smoking. Ignore Al's brown fingers. Ignore his yellow teeth. In order to avoid guilt, do not look at the state of their clothing. Do not see the hole in the elbow of Al's sweatshirt or the ragged, threadbare legs of his jeans. Do not see that Kathy is wearing a shirt that is a size too small and used to have a bow or button at the neck. When Kathy pulls her glasses from her bag to read the menu, do not notice that the left arm is missing from the frames. Ignore the way they tilt on her face. Do not notice her missing teeth, the yawning black gaps at the back of her mouth. Kathy will sigh, she will exclaim, she will say over and over again how happy she is to see you. Al will move constantly as if his nerves are on strings, his loose limbs shrugging and fingers twitching, his knees jiggling to an unheard song, his thighs swinging wide and then jostling back. Pretend not to notice. When Al says, "My brain's just not right today," pretend you didn't hear. Keep it level. Keep the conversation clean. Do not address blank. This will be plural. Remember how beautiful Kathy once was as she sits in her floral shirt designed for the obesely overweight, her fingers strangled by rings that once fit, her breath heavy, her yellow fingernails scratching at her neck. Remember the time you slept on your grandmother's living room couch and Kathy stayed up all night, stubbing out cigarettes in the overfilled ashtrays on her kitchen table, calling the operator to ask the time, talking to herself about things that hadn't happened, moving in and out of the fluorescent overhead light. Remember Al coming into that kitchen with the radio to his ear, his hair greasy and his glasses smeared. The threat of violence as he said, "Don't you shout at me," or "Ma, you need to get the hell out." The time your mother guided you out to the car by your shoulder, how your grandmother called them bad days, as in Alfred is having a bad day. Remember how no one got them help. When Kathy starts a sentence with "I remember," or "I miss," or "I wish," or a lengthened O, ask her if she needs another napkin, or if you can get her anything else to eat. If Kathy is so medicated that she sits and stares and doesn't seem to understand what is happening when you say her name, take your time eating and relax. When Al starts to mumble to himself under his breath, ask for the check. Tip well. Smile at the waitress. Attempt a gracious exit. Do not make eye contact with the other diners as you move towards the door. Do not wait for the leftovers to be packed up. Do not order dessert. Thank you. So, can I answer any questions?
Have you presented before, like, say, lies, which is limited domestic violence, I think it's in Lebanon, New Hampshire, or anything like that?
No, I have not. This is a really new book, so that might be a next step.
Yeah, I think it would. I think women would relate to each and every one of those stories. Now, your book doesn't come out until August.
Yeah, I mean, it is available. I would assume if you ordered it now, it would arrive. So technically its birthday is August 13th, but it is in stock in the warehouse. So I think it's available secretly.
Will you have your books of poetry out here?
I would assume. I'm not sure what was ordered, but I would assume they would have ordered more than one book.
Really powerful stories.
Thank you.
The first one, I can't imagine being the parent and listening to my child be beaten.
Yeah, I mean, one of the themes of the book is this sense of denial, and that is one of the things that I struggled with, as I've sort of suggested, during my childhood. That piece about the procedures in part implies my frustration that we dealt with it that way, and that my father, because I mean, he had 3 siblings who were mentally ill. He was the only one who was not. And so he always lived in this shadow of fear about his own mental health. And so the way that he, and I think also his parents, survived it, you know, they were an old world Italian family, was to just pretend it wasn't happening, which obviously was the worst possible choice for his siblings. To this day, you know, only one is alive. Kathy is still alive, and he goes to visit her and he takes care of her as much as he possibly can, but it's a very carefully done process for him. But you're absolutely right. I mean, that kind of abuse, and to listen to it happen must have been really difficult.
The letter, an obvious question is, did it work? Is this the original letter, or did you have to reconstruct it? Did you have the original letter?
Yeah.
Or,
yeah, no.
Maybe it's a spoiler on the book. Perhaps she's saying that I would hope you'd say in the book what happened for the judge.
Yeah. So things. Yeah, maybe I shouldn't tell. I did not have the original letter. I did keep. It's really interesting because I did keep the newspaper clipping about my arrest, and I did keep. The lawyer wrote a letter to me after all of this happened saying that neither of these boys gave up my name. So they actually told me that they had given up my name in order to get me to give up their names. And so it was a complete manipulation on the part of the police. But the lawyer then wrote to me and he said, neither Harry nor Joe said anything about you being involved. So the police were, they also had me sign my rights away on a piece of paper. So they said to me, you know, once you sign this piece of paper, we can tell you what's going on. I signed the piece of paper. They then took a full statement from me where I thought I was giving them information about someone else's crime, but in actuality, I had been arrested. And there was no point where they said, you're under arrest, or read me my rights, so I had absolutely no idea that I was giving them evidence against myself. So that was really interesting. So yeah, the book does sort of tell what happened. I mean, obviously I'm gainfully employed, so you know, it was a felony, but my mother would be horrified if she doesn't yet know this book exists. So don't tell her if you know her, because she was really like embarrassed by it, and I can see why. But it ended up all right. But it was tough. It was a really hard thing to go through, as I was very naive. I had just started college. I was sort of like, I'm going to help the police now, and I didn't know what I was getting into, so thank you. Other questions?
Well, I guess you just kind of answered my question, but I was curious about how your family, you're processing a lot in this book, and
Yeah.
so I'm curious about how they've reacted to that.
Yeah, you know, that's a great question. I really wanted to. My dad's family is so much in this book, and there's a lot of affection, but there is also obviously a processing of how things were handled. And initially, he said to me, I will be really interested to read what you've written. But then the advanced reader's copies came out, and I said, it's here, and it's an object, and, you know, I sort of tried to give it to him. And he sort of took it, and he opened it, and he kind of like leafed through it a little bit, and then he sort of closed it and he gave it back to me. And so later that day I said to him, Dad, I'm really sorry if you're like, I apologize for writing about your family if you wish I hadn't. I was upset. I said, if you would have hoped that I wouldn't do that. And he just said to me, you have to understand it's something I don't talk about. I have been ashamed of it for my whole life. It's something that my parents worked to hide away, that we all really glossed over. He said, so I am happy that you wrote about something you felt you needed to write about, but I may not ever read it. Which was really, for me, so touching, because he sort of said to me, it's your material, you went through it, but he said it's hard for me. My mother, hi Mom. I don't know. I haven't told her about the book. I think she'll eventually find out, and that'll be fine. I mean, she's just not going to be happy that I told the whole world. Like she worked really hard to get that criminal thing taken care of.
Keep an eye out.
So we'll see.
It's interesting to me. So my background is also Italian family,
Yeah.
and with aunts and uncles who also dealt with mental illness. So this is really just spot on from a child's point of view. Like I can so totally get what you're saying, like because it's exactly how I saw it. But I think also like there's this underlying theme in your writing and also just in remembering the things in my own life of that shame. Like you, like the parents had that shame, even though it had nothing to do with them. They had this shame, and so there was no talking about these things. They were just like everybody knew they existed, but nobody actually. They did just like this description of the procedures is just so spot on, having come from such a similar background, and nobody even ever thinking it was weird, like or saying like this is like bizarre, like why aren't we talking about? And then looking at it from like hindsight and looking at it now, and how differently we handle most of the time mental illness now to then, and I never actually thought about it until you started reading from my aunts and uncles and my father's point of view of how they got there. So it's really impactful, beautifully written.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you feel that way. I mean, I understand that it is, I want people to understand that this is not my view of mental illness, that this is how I perceived it as a child, that there were stigmas attached to it in my family that I had to inherit and I had to perpetuate while I was the child. And it's been really interesting to try to deal with that as an adult and figure it out as someone who understands things about mental illness and the way that the mentally ill should be treated or thought about. And I've talked to my dad about it a lot, but he, I think he's never gonna be able to completely let go, because also his parents' behavior emotionally affected him as well. I mean, he was like there in this sort of tornado of his parents just trying to hide all of this away. I mean, that's why, so Kathy lived in this apartment underneath their house that they owned, that they used to rent out, so that she could be almost hidden. And her husband lived there as well, and then she lived there until she was institutionalized. So, and there's a section in the book where my father and I are cleaning out the apartment and going through her things and what that really means for us. So absolutely, I'm glad that you feel it's accurate, and I am hoping that people understand that it is from that family perspective, and that it feels so strange from outside of it, no one questioned it.
Yeah, and it takes a long time when you're in that, and then like to go away from it and see it from. So it's like you're getting you're writing about how it was and how you saw it then, but also from this now perspective that you have about it. It's very powerful.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much.
I think years ago too, there was so much shame that you didn't want to air out the family laundry, so to speak, so you kept it to yourself. And,
Absolutely.
but I think it's great that you bring these things out now, because I think there are a lot of people still affected, even though things have changed now. There's still that same feeling there was probably years ago of my aunt married a man whose sister. I remember she lived with them for a little while, and all I remember is she used to go out on the balcony. She never spoke, and just looked out, and everybody just thought, wow, Aunt Laura, she's kind of weird. But nobody ever knew anything about her. I don't remember eating with her or,
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I do think more than we believe the instinct to hide stuff like this still exists, right? I think it's very easy for us to say it's different now and we would be more open, but there's not really any real successful treatment much of the time, right? And so this part about Kathy being medicated to a certain degree, you know, that's what they do. They just medicate up to a certain point so that there's no violence or no strife. And there's no way to fix it, and so people really don't. I still think we don't fully understand that it is a physical illness like any other physical illness, and so I think we do have that tendency to be like, this is something we should be ashamed about. But I think we're making progress. So hopefully.
So beautifully written, and the images are just so clear and distinct, and it's really beautiful. Was it hard to jump from like just writing poetry and then writing a novel?
So this book started when my kids were very young, and I found that I couldn't write poetry because this may seem strange because poetry seems like it's shorter, but for me it took more attention to write a poem. I mean, I had to have serious, quiet space around me all the time to write a poem. And it's not like I could go to the coffee shop and sit down and write poems when I had an hour. So I started writing prose, and I started writing, first it was this sort of story of my aunt, and then it started to be about the arrest, and then about this other relationship. And I actually wrote it for 3, 4, 5 years, and I didn't know what was going to happen with it, and I actually probably wrote 3 times as much as is here in this book. I was actually writing for my life. I was just like, I don't know what's going to happen, I don't know if I'm ever going to be able to write poems again, but at least I'm writing something. And a lot of it was very bad, and a lot of it was maybe better, but in the end, it's all sat there for at least 3 or 4 years untouched. And then I went back and I said, let me look and see if there's anything in here that's worth keeping and pulling out. And I was surprised to find that there were parts that I was like, oh, these are actually pretty good. And then I was able to write other pieces that filled in the gaps of that better writing. So it was a really weird process. So no, it was actually a really natural thing. I needed to do it. To move to prose just because of the attention span shift, and thank God for it, because I think I would have struggled in a serious way as a new mother. So it was great to have that option. Thank you. Any other last questions? Yeah.
Mary Carr, the Liars Club, his blistering memoir, The Mother's Horrible, and all this. And she then wrote a book about memoir, and kind of told how she dealt with the family. And she basically sent the material, she sent the writing to them and asked them if there's anything they wanted to change, anything they objected to. She said, the book is going to come out. You're not going to pull the book because you don't like it. And she was surprised at how little negative. It's okay.
Yeah, interesting.
And then the mother sort of gets into this and starts showing up at all. She's like a celebrity. She shows up at all the readings. So it's just interesting. So I don't know what the right way would be. But at least for her, it seemed like a horrible story with horrible characters.
Turned into it. It's interesting.
You might get a much, when it comes out, a surprise.
I hope so. I mean, I think, I'm hoping just that one day my dad reads it, because he's a real savior in it in a lot of places, and we are very close. Again, my mother thinks she's a little bit more in denial about our relationship, and I've been open with her about some of the issues I've had with our relationship, and I write some of that in the book. And I have not seen any real growth or change in her as I've tried to work on our relationship. So maybe I should hand this to her and see what happens. Maybe it'll be the or I get disowned, right? No, it's a real roll of the dice, or maybe not. So maybe I will just continue to choose who sees the reviews on Facebook very carefully. So, we'll see. But it's interesting to be someone who's been writing professionally in a different genre for so long, and suddenly to be like, okay, here's my whole life. It's been really very enjoyable in some ways, but also, it's interesting. Yeah. Thank you all so much for being here.